The Vikings didn't lose a single major war. They weren't conquered. They weren't wiped out by plague. Yet somehow, the most terrifying warriors Europe had ever seen just stopped, disappeared. And the reason they vanished? It's the last thing you'd ever guess. Picture Scandinavia around 700 AD. Beautiful mountains, stunning fjords, and soil so rocky you couldn't grow a decent turnip if your life depended on it. Which, unfortunately, it did. Only about 1 to 2% of the land could actually produce food. That's not a typo. 98% of the ground was basically useless for farming. Meanwhile, the population roughly doubled between 700 and 900 AD. Do the math. More mouths. Same tiny farms. Something had to give. Here's where it gets interesting. Scandinavian inheritance laws handed everything to the eldest son. The house, the livestock, the land. Younger brothers, they got a handshake and good luck wishes. So you're a 20-year-old Viking with no inheritance, no prospects, and no future. What exactly are your options? Become a fisherman and freeze to death slowly? Or grab an axe and take what you need from someone else? Not a hard choice, honestly, but timing mattered too. A warming climate between 800 and 1000 AD melted ice routes that had been frozen for centuries. Suddenly, voyages that would have been suicide missions became actually survivable. And those Norwegian fjords, natural shipyards, hidden from enemies, perfect for building fleets in secret. The first big test came in 793 AD, Lindisfarne Monastery, a tiny island off the English coast, monks with gold chalices, silver crosses, and absolutely zero combat training. That single raid netted more wealth than an entire village might see in a decade. Word spread fast. Raiding worked. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Vikings weren't just desperate farmers with boats. They had technology that made European navies look like floating bathtubs. And that technology, it changed everything about how wars could be fought. The longship. Honestly, it's the most underrated war machine in human history. While European boats sat deep in the water like pregnant whales, Viking ships drew only 3 feet. 3 feet. That meant raiders could sail straight up rivers that defenders assumed were impossible to navigate. They'd beach directly onto shores, hop out, and start swinging axes before anyone knew what happened. The secret was something called clinker-built construction. Overlapping planks riveted together, kind of like fish scales. This made the hull flexible enough to bend with ocean waves instead of snapping apart. European ships, built rigid, hit a big wave wrong, and you're swimming. Speed mattered too. A standard longship could hit 15 knots under sail. For reference, that's faster than any naval vessel Europeans could put in the water against them. You can't catch what you can't keep up with. But here's the detail that really blew my mind when I first learned it. Viking crews could row their ships backward. Sounds simple. It wasn't. Square-sailed European vessels couldn't do this at all. So Vikings would raid a beach, grab everything valuable, and reverse straight out while defenders were still organizing a response. The craftsmanship bordered on obsessive. When archaeologists dug up the Gokstad ship in 1880, the wood was still intact, after 1,000 years in the ground. These people weren't just good at building boats, they were artists. And navigation. Vikings used sunstones, calcite crystals that could locate the sun's position even through heavy clouds or fog. No compasses needed. They crossed open ocean while other sailors hugged coastlines for safety. Superior ships gave Vikings options nobody else had. But superior ships don't explain why entire kingdoms just handed over their treasures without fighting. Here's the thing about Vikings that most documentaries get wrong. They weren't mindless berserkers who attacked everything that moved. They were calculated businessmen who happened to carry axes. Monasteries became primary targets for one simple reason. Monks kept meticulous inventory records of every golden chalice, every silver candlestick, every jeweled manuscript cover. Vikings basically had shopping lists before they arrived. And who guarded these treasures? Unarmed men in robes who'd taken vows of peace. Timing mattered too. Raiders would show up at dawn during Sunday services. Why? Because that's when the entire community packed into one building with zero weapons. It's almost unfair when you think about it. But the psychological warfare, that's what really fascinates me. Vikings deliberately left survivors, not out of mercy. They wanted those survivors to run screaming to the next village describing exactly what happened. Fear traveled faster than long ships ever could. By the time Vikings reached the third or fourth target, people were already fleeing with whatever they could carry. The Great Heathen Army that landed in England in 865 numbered somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 warriors. For context, that's bigger than most European armies of the period. This wasn't raiding anymore. This was conquest. And then someone figured out the real money trick. European kings would pay enormous bribes called Danegeld just to make Vikings go away. One raid on the French monastery of Jumièges in 841 captured 68 monks, every single one sold as slaves for silver. Terror became an actual business model. Why fight when people just hand you money? But something strange happened when Vikings stopped leaving. Turns out you can't terrorize people you're trying to live next to. Here's where the Viking story gets weird. The same people who burned villages started building them. Turns out raiding has a shelf life. You can only rob a monastery once. But control the trade route to that monastery? Now you're collecting fees forever. Vikings were brutal, sure, but they weren't stupid. Rollo the Walker figured this out before anyone else. In 911 AD, the French king basically handed him Normandy. Not because Rollo asked nicely, because Rollo promised to stop other Vikings from raiding. The French were essentially paying a protection fee to the biggest bully on the block. Genius, honestly. And it worked. The Danelaw in England covered roughly 1/3 of the entire country. Scandinavian law replaced Anglo-Saxon customs overnight. If you lived there, you followed Viking rules. Period. But here's the part nobody talks about. Dublin started as a slave trading post around 841 AD, absolutely horrific beginnings. Yet within decades, it became one of Europe's wealthiest port cities. The same hands that once carried chains started counting coins. Settling conquered land required something raiders never needed: diplomacy. You can't terrorize your neighbor when you're trying to sell him grain next week. Makes business meetings awkward. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. Within 2 generations, many Viking settlers in England couldn't even speak Old Norse anymore. Their kids had Christian names. They attended church on Sundays. They complained about taxes like everyone else. My grandfather used to say the fastest way to tame a wild dog is to give him a warm bed. Apparently works for Vikings too, but becoming European came with strings attached. Specifically, a cross-shaped string that would unravel everything Vikings once believed. Christianity didn't conquer the Vikings with swords, it conquered them with paperwork. Here's what missionaries figured out early. Walk into a Viking hall screaming about hellfire, you're getting thrown out. But whisper to the king that God personally chose him to rule, now you've got his attention. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark converted around 965 AD. Not because he suddenly loved Jesus, because German armies were massing at his border, ready to invade and civilize those pesky heathens. Getting baptized was cheaper than getting conquered. Smart guy, honestly. But conversion came with hidden costs nobody mentioned up front. The church brought literate clergy who could manage taxes, write laws, and keep records. Sounds helpful, right? Except now kings could track wealth that Viking nobles had hidden for generations. Try explaining that missing silver to a bishop with a ledger. Then came the marriage rules. The church banned cousin marriage. Sounds minor until you realize Viking clans had married cousins specifically to keep land and power concentrated. One papal decree scattered fortunes that took centuries to build. And the burial thing. Vikings used to burn their dead with swords, gold, treasure, everything a warrior needed in Valhalla. Christian burial, you go in the ground with nothing. All that wealth stayed behind. Stayed where the church could suggest how it should be spent. By 1000 AD, Iceland's parliament voted to adopt Christianity. The debate took one day. Not because of deep spiritual conviction, because Christian Europe refused to trade with heathens. When faith affects your wallet, theology gets simpler. My father always said free gifts come with invisible price tags. Vikings learned this the hard way. But religion was only half the problem. While Vikings were building churches, their enemies were building something far more dangerous. Europeans finally stopped being Viking punching bags. Took them about 2 centuries, but they figured it out. King Alfred of Wessex had a brilliantly simple idea. Build fortified towns called burhs positioned so nobody lived more than 20 miles from safety. Vikings show up, everyone runs to the nearest burh. Raiders find lock gates and arrow slits instead of screaming peasants. Suddenly raiding requires actual sieges. Vikings hated sieges. Too slow, too boring, too many casualties. But Alfred wasn't done. He built England's first real navy, not merchant ships with swords strapped on, actual warships designed to intercept longships before they touched shore. Fighting Vikings on water? Bold move. Worked better than expected. The French got creative too. They built fortified bridges across every major river. Remember how Vikings sailed inland to surprise wealthy towns? Hard to surprise anyone when your ship crashes into a stone bridge guarded by angry Franks. One engineering project canceled centuries of raiding tactics. Then came the castles. Not wooden halls you could burn in an afternoon. Stone fortresses that would take months to crack. A Viking warband needed speed. They'd grab treasure and vanish before armies mobilized. Castle walls changed that math completely. Now defenders could wait while the king's army marched closer every day. European cavalry adapted too. They stopped defending and started pursuing. Chase raiders before they reached their ships, recover the plunder, kill stragglers. Vikings weren't used to being hunted. Ireland's Brian Boru unified competing kingdoms for one specific reason: build armies large enough to match Viking forces. Unity through hatred. Classic military strategy. The easy targets hardened. The soft victims learned to bite back. But here's what really killed the Viking spirit. It wasn't swords or castles. It was something far more seductive. Money. The same Vikings who burned monasteries for gold started building trading posts instead. Turns out there's a problem with raiding the same places over and over. Eventually, there's nothing left to steal. But trading? That's the gift that keeps on giving. Viking merchants established routes stretching from Baghdad to Newfoundland. We're talking about Scandinavians haggling with Arab merchants over silk prices, drinking tea with Byzantine traders, swapping furs for silver in markets where nobody had ever seen a longship. And the weird part is, it worked better than violence. Arabic silver flooded into Scandinavia. Historians estimate around 125 million Islamic coins crossed into Viking hands between 800 and 1000 AD. That's not a typo, 125 million. Every dig site in Sweden seems to uncover another hoard of foreign currency. Here's the catch, though. Merchants need repeat customers. Hard to sell walrus ivory to a guy whose father you beheaded last summer. Violence became bad for business. Hedeby in Denmark grew to 1,500 permanent residents, a proper town with craftsmen, warehouses, and tax collectors. The economy now depended on peace. Burning down trading partners meant burning down your own retirement fund. Then came the marriages. Viking traders married local women. Their kids grew up speaking multiple languages, belonging to multiple worlds. When war broke out, whose side do you pick? Your father's people or your mother's? The hungriest young men, the ones who would have crewed raiding ships a century earlier, now bought farmland with trading profits. They settled down, had families, stopped being Vikings entirely. Success killed the warrior spirit more effectively than any enemy army ever could. But internal rot goes deeper than commerce. Back in Scandinavia, something worse was brewing. While Vikings were getting rich abroad, Scandinavia was tearing itself apart. The 11th century turned into one massive family feud. Brothers killing brothers, cousins assassinating cousins, kings lasting about as long as milk in summer. Everyone wanted the throne and nobody wanted to share. Harald Hardrada spent years conquering Denmark. Years, thousands of warriors dead, massive war chests emptied. And for what? By the time he sailed for England in 1066, his army was exhausted before they even landed. 3 weeks. That's how long Norway's finest warriors survived after touching English soil. The Battle of Stamford Bridge wasn't just a defeat. It was a generation of experienced fighters, gone. My grandfather used to say, never start a land war in Asia. Well, apparently, nobody told Harold about starting one in Yorkshire. Denmark somehow managed worse. Between 1131 and 1157, they crowned 9 different kings. 9! That's a new monarch every 3 years. Half these guys probably never finished unpacking their coronation robes. Then there's Sweden. Christians versus pagans slugging it out for decades. Resources that could have funded raids to France. Burned up fighting neighbors who worship different gods. Here's what nobody expected. Kings got smart. They realized taxing raiders was easier than joining them. Private warfare became financially impossible when the crown took its cut first. Try funding a longship when the tax collector wants 40%. The warrior class didn't die in foreign battles. They died in Scandinavian ones, fighting each other over crowns and cattle and old grudges. All that legendary ferocity turned inward. But internal bleeding wasn't the only problem. Nature itself was about to betray everything the Vikings had built. Mother Nature turned traitor. For 300 years, Vikings caught the luckiest weather break in European history. The medieval warm period made Greenland actually green. Pack ice retreated. Growing seasons stretched long enough to feed expanding populations. Then around 1250, the thermostat dropped. Hard. Greenland's colonies watched their cattle die first. Then the sheep. Then themselves. Supply ships couldn't punch through ice that used to melt by spring. The last recorded contact with Greenland Vikings, 1408. After that, silence. An entire civilization just gone, like they walked into a freezer and nobody opened the door. Iceland got hammered too. Volcanic eruptions poisoned grazing land. Famines hit back to back. The population crashed from 70,000 to 35,000 in a single century. That's half the island, dead. But here's what really killed Viking military operations. Shorter summers meant shorter campaign seasons. You can't raid Paris when autumn storms will sink your ship on the way home. My uncle tried sailing in October once. Said the waves made him religious for about 6 hours. Then came the real nightmare. 1349. The Black Death arrived in Norway aboard a ship from England. Within 2 years, half of Scandinavia was dead. Half. Entire villages wiped out. Farms abandoned. Ships rotting in harbors because nobody remained alive to crew them. The warrior culture that built an empire suddenly couldn't spare young men for foreign adventures. They needed every surviving body working fields, raising livestock, just keeping communities alive. Vikings didn't lose to English knights or French fortifications. They lost to weather and disease. Nature doesn't negotiate, and those who survived, they faced an even stranger fate. They stopped being Vikings entirely. Here's the strangest twist in Viking history. They won, not through conquest, through bloodlines. William the Conqueror, the guy who remade England in 1066, great-great-grandson of Rollo, that Viking raider who couldn't fit on horses. The Norman knights who crushed Anglo-Saxon England were basically Vikings with better table manners and fancier helmets. My history professor called this the Long Con. Vikings terrorized Europe for 3 centuries. Then their grandchildren inherited it. But that inheritance came with a price: identity death. Scandinavian countries joined the Hanseatic League, a German-dominated trading network that valued predictability over plunder. Hard to raid your business partners, bad for quarterly earnings. Norse languages started bleeding into local tongues. Norman French today contains hundreds of Old Norse words. When you say husband, sky, or window, you're speaking Viking without knowing it. They colonized the dictionary. Churches in Copenhagen started looking identical to churches in Paris. Same architecture, same rituals, same robes. Walk into a Scandinavian cathedral. By 1100, you couldn't tell whether you were in Denmark or Germany. And the warriors themselves, they became knights, bishops, tax collectors. The great-grandchildren of men who burned monasteries now managed them. Makes sense, right? Every culture eventually settles down. The final nail came on September 25th, 1066. King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the last proper Viking king, caught an English arrow through the throat at Stamford Bridge. Historians mark this moment as the official end of the Viking Age. 3 centuries of terror, ended by one well-aimed shot. Vikings didn't vanish. They evolved, absorbed, became the very Europe they once held hostage. The raiders became the establishment, and nobody saw it coming except maybe their accountants.